Hello, and welcome to the last program in a three-part webinar series presented by Library Strategies, Governance Structures and Best Practices, a dive into library foundation boards with the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. Library Strategies is the consulting group of the Friends. We partner with library organizations nationally and internationally to cultivate their potential so that they can better serve and strengthen their communities. I'm Elaine Hopkins, Director of Programs and Services for the Friends and Director of Library Strategies, and I'm so pleased to have you here with us today to delve into library foundation boards and advocacy. Each webinar has featured the Friends President, Beth Burns, in conversation with trustees. Today's webinar, The Foundation Board's Role in Advocating for the Library, is a discussion with recent Advocacy Committee Chair, Ted Davis. I am sorry to report that our current Advocacy Chair, Dur Yang, is unable to be a part of today's webinar due to illness. Beth and Ted will engage in a conversation and take questions at the end. So please feel free to enter your questions in the chat as the program progresses. We'll relay them to the presenters. Also, please share your name and where you are coming from or where you are from in the chat. We'd love to know a little bit more about you. And so now, without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters. Ted Davis is Executive Vice President, Public Affairs at Weber Shandwick, a global communication consultancy. He served as a trustee of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library since 2015. Ted brings more than 30 years of experience counseling business and community leaders on communication strategy, advocacy, media relationships, and working effectively in the public arena. His clients have included the University of Minnesota, Fairview Health Services, Ramsey County, the League of Minnesota Cities Insurance Trust, and numerous associations and business advocacy organizations. He's a frequent speaker on public affairs issues and has served as adjunct faculty at the University of Minnesota and Metropolitan State University. Beth Burns has served as president of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library for 5 years. Her prior nonprofit experience includes leadership roles with the Minnesota Zoo, Guthrie Theater, Lutheran Music Program, and MacPhail Center for Music. As a trustee, she's served on numerous boards, including Minnesota Citizens for the Arts, 15 Head Theater Lab, the Minnesota Association for Arts Educators, and she's a co-founder and officer of the nonprofit Minnesota Music Coalition. Beth is currently a member of the Metropolitan Library Service Agency Board of Trustees. And now, please take it away, Beth.
Thank you, Elaine, and welcome everyone who is here with us. It is so fun seeing how truly national this convening is this afternoon. So love seeing everybody's information in the chat about who you are and where you're from. So again, thank you. I'm really excited to be spending this part of the afternoon with Ted Davis. Ted and I have spent many an afternoon together over the course of the last 5.5, 6 years of my tenure, and Ted's advocacy for the St. Paul Public Library goes back many years prior to that. If we're successful today, we are going to help demystify advocacy, champion all that advocacy can be and bring to your organization on behalf of your library, and offer some insights that are going to help you actually engage in advocacy in your local communities. So Ted, I would love to start with maybe the most complex and maybe the most simple question. What is advocacy?
Well, thanks, Beth, and welcome everybody. It's really the work of reaching out to the people who have who help determine your success, telling your story, and in the case of libraries, helping them to support you through whatever resources they have to make available to you. It's really telling the library story to the people who fund and lead and allow libraries to continue to operate.
Super. And I know a lot of people who are joining us today are really, really skilled at fundraising, are recognized champions for libraries in their own community, but it surprises me sometimes how many friends and foundations have not sort of delved into advocacy. on behalf of their library as a companion to that fundraising. Can you talk a little bit about why library advocacy matters? Like why libraries, why now, why advocacy?
Well, I mean, we could spend a better part of the afternoon talking about why libraries are important, about the things that they provide in the community, about the reason that they're critical to the health of a community. The job of the advocate is to take those stories and bring them to the people who help determine the success, the future of the library, who bring resources to the library. Largely, it's elected bodies. In most communities, some level of elected body determines the budget of your public library. And they have a fair amount of discretion with how they allocate their funds. They have a fair amount of discretion on setting priorities, if it's the city council for the community in itself, and if it's a library board for the libraries. The advocacy helps focus the resources. It helps you build and perhaps even increase the resources that are available for your library.
Great. In St. Paul, there is a really long history. We talk as the Friends about the importance of the public-private partnership and the idea of leveraging the strength of the private investment that our Friends organization makes to the library every year in order to maximize public investment. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the Friends history, just so we ground the conversation in what do we do here in St. Paul? So as the conversation expands, we're sort of all grounded in that idea of like, what is Friends advocacy in St. Paul look like?
Sure. It really focuses on our city council. For those of you who don't know St. Paul, it's governed by a strong mayor policy council committee. The mayor recommends a budget for all city departments, including the library, to the council, and the council crafts the budget that ultimately goes into effect for the year. So it's a collaborative process. Sometimes it's a conflicting process. Sometimes it's a contentious process. What we have done over many, many years as the Friends is been really intentional about building relationships with the mayor and the city council, and for that matter, the library directors. We've always maintained a very strong relationship with the infrastructure inside the libraries, both in terms of crafting how we support them with our work outside of the library budget and how we can turn the power of the people to craft a library budget that's adequate. And the bottom line is that in St. Paul, I would expect in most communities, the bulk of the library's resources come from taxes, and which are allocated by elected bodies. And so we, over the long life, the Friends of St. Paul Public Libraries have had a strong relationship, both with the mayors and with the city council. We've been able to leverage those relationships to really help play a significant role in the crafting of the library budget. Now, the reality is that there's a base of a library budget that is set. You got to maintain the buildings. You got to hire people. You got to have librarians. You got to have people doing the work of the library. But there's a lot of discretion, and there's a lot of creativity that can go into how libraries work and how libraries are funded. And as most of you who work in libraries know, that libraries for many, many years have not been just repositories of books. They are places where there are books, but they also are gathering places for the community. They are places where the priorities of the community can be delivered to the people, because they are in many cases if not the front door of the community. We've operated that way at the Friends. And so we, as I mentioned earlier on, we have been very intentional about having strong relationships within city government, both in how our board gets crafted, how our governing board gets crafted, how we seek out particular volunteers in the community, and how once on the board and connected with the Friends, we try and build and solidify relationships with the policymakers who determine the budget of the library. We are also in a really good position as we're often a co-funder of events and activities within the library, up to and including we've managed numerous capital campaigns for library renovations and the capital needs of our library. So we have a symbiotic relationship with the council. What that does is it opens doors. And so we've had a general pattern of how we've operated over the years. The city has a budget cycle. It begins with the mayor making a recommendation, a budget, as I've mentioned before, turns it over to the council. The council then does its thing, and either a very similar or very different budget emerges from that process. Right. And our role is to help craft that process to make sure that libraries are appropriately resourced for the work that we want them to do.
Yeah, and I think there's so much embedded in what you've said, and I'm sort of thinking about your comments in the life cycle of the year, the calendar year. So our city budget functions on a calendar year. I'm thinking about questions I want to ask you, and I'm going to start right at the top of the year with one of the primary relationships, which you mentioned in passing, but I think is really, it's where it all starts. The need for us to listen to and talk to and be in close, trusted relationship with the library director or whomever the leader is of the library. And so I think about in our calendar year, the first meetings we do are often meetings with our advocacy committee, and we'll talk about what makes up our advocacy committee later. But meeting with the library director, in this case, to hear her vision for needs and wants and expansions and innovations and ways in which the library needs funding to serve the community, and really shaping our approach to advocacy based on what we understand the library needs. And I'm wondering if you want to speak any more to that.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been fortunate in St. Paul. We've had long-standing good relationships with libraries going back decades, library directors going back decades. And you got to understand your roles. The library director knows what the priorities are. The library director knows what the libraries need. The library director is on the ground and working with the people in the libraries. We are, in a sense, removed from that. And in the case of our library director, she's always articulated a clear vision of what the library needs to be and shared that vision with us, actually shaped that vision with us. And as a consequence, we are very, very comfortable going into meetings with electeds, her bosses, with hand in glove with what the library director sees as the greatest needs. And that's a never-ending conversation that the friends and the community has with the library director, and it really does shape where we define the resource needs.
Yep, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I've certainly, one of the things I really enjoy about the advocacy work that the Friends does and that I've sort of been able to step into and get involved with is, again, thinking about that public-private partnership. And I just encourage everyone on this call to not underestimate the importance of the private resources, no matter how big or how small that you're bringing to the table, because these elected officials are so frequently being asked to find money, but not like also having, and will bring money to the table. The way funding in St. Paul's library system for growth has worked is many programs that are considered pilot programs or new and innovative programs, they are first funded by the Friends, by the private fundraising dollars that we can raise. And then our advocacy work in many of our years, in addition to funding the general operations, the staff, the building maintenance, the materials and collections and things, a lot of our advocacy work, pre-pandemic at least, was designed to take things off of that pilot phase and move them onto the general fund of the library funded by taxpayer dollars, and make those things like the social worker, like homework centers, like sort of the culturally specific community focus of the community services program. I'm trying to think of some of the other recent programs, bringing those into the general operations budget of the library, and really sort of achieving proof of concept on the private side of the ledger, and then advocating for general funding in perpetuity to make sure that that just is integrated into general library operations. But that all comes from the library director's vision and direction and prioritization, as you say, of what is next needed and what the library needs to do new and differently to serve the community.
Well, and that leadership that we've received from the library directors has helped us and made us more expansive on what the work of the library is. There was a time when much of what we went in and talked about was collections. How do you fund the collections? How do we bring more money to buy more books, to buy more pieces of the collection? All important. People depend on the libraries for those kinds of things. But as the role of the library has been recognized as being one of the great contributors to our education system, one of the places where people gather, a safe space for members of our community, we have piloted and sought funding for numerous programs. And Beth mentioned those programs, and then we bring those when the concept is proven, because in the end, if the community values that, it's got to move on to the budget. Mm-hmm. And so we go in and we make the case that, for example, social workers in the library, it's turned out to be a successful and important program. Our job as the advocacy committee was say, okay, we've proven this is a public good. It's important to the health of the community. Now let's move it into the budget of the library so we can move on to the next important thing that the libraries can do.
Yep. I'm going to continue to stay focused at this point on sort of those advocacy messages and that content piece, because I will say everything really changed in 2020, not only due to the pandemic, but also we are the community in which George Floyd was murdered by the police, and the resulting racial unrest and the social justice uprisings that followed have transformed, I think, conversations globally, but at a local level, it was real. It was in our backyards, in our alleys, on our streets, down the block from literally 2 of our library branches and multiple branches in the city of Minneapolis, our sister city. And in 2020, any intention we would have had to say, like, you should expand the materials budget, or, we just screeching halt recognized we needed to take that step back, recognize that our message needed to meet the moment. And we really, really pivoted how we talked about the importance of library funding when city budgets were falling apart. We had a major thoroughfare in St. Paul itself that was going to be needing to be rebuilt and reinvested in after destructive looting that was people taking advantage of a situation that was already, riddled with grief and unrest. We had some pretty big issues that we were going to need to fund, not even to mention the pandemic, in St. Paul. And do you want me, Ted, to run through the list of kind of our platform, or do you want to speak to kind of how we just took that step back and really reframed what library advocacy looked like from 2020 and how that's still affecting us today?
Yeah, if you'd start with a letter, because I think that's important.
So in 2020, we all went home in March. George Floyd was murdered at the end of May, and June, our cities were on fire. And by July, the mayor was shaping his budget for the coming year. And like I said, we knew we couldn't just walk in and say, please maintain the library's budget, and we'd like a collections increase. It just would not have met the moment at all. And so we, rather than even asking for time with the mayor, which is something we would normally do as part of our advocacy cycle, a sit-down meeting, instead we wrote a letter, and we had our entire board of directors and our advocacy committee sign that letter. And we just simply sent it to him and said, we're not going to ask for your time right now, but we want you to remember, we want you to talk about, and we want you to fund the library. now more than ever, even though that may seem counterintuitive, because when you fund the library, you support public safety. When you fund the library, you dismantle systemic racism. When you fund the library, you rebuild the workforce and you strengthen the economy, and you achieve digital equity and inclusion through training, through software, through hardware. People were out of jobs. We needed to get people back to work. They needed the tools to do so. And we have a huge number of people in St. Paul that do not have consistent and regular access to the internet in their homes. We wanted to talk about the role of the library closing educational gaps. You need to fund this, you need to talk about this in relation to the library, that equitable outcomes for all school children needed the library as a partner. And finally, social connection. We were really beginning to understand how vital social connection was when we were isolated, we were living at home, our neighbors were not interacting in ways that we have done for years and years, and we had the additional social disconnect that was the result of all of the unrest in our community. And so our letter was really just a public statement of support for the library framed against the community's needs. And it has, I think it's fair to say, and Ted, I'm curious, I feel like it's completely transformed how we approach our advocacy work from that moment forward.
Yeah, it did change. And it's worthwhile to say, prior we tended to insert ourselves into council-mayor relations as a way to both to get to what we needed, but also there was often disagreement between the mayor's office and the council. That year and going forward, we said there's just not room for that, and laid out a what amounted to a mission statement about the libraries and where the role of the city in funding it. And it was well received. It changed and it was a brutal budget year. Nobody got what they wanted. Nobody got what they felt they needed. We went in and said, we just want to maintain equity, and we want to have the libraries poised to be there as we approach normalcy and start meeting these needs. And it certainly changed the way that we approach the following year's advocacy, in that we did have the traditional meeting with the mayor at the beginning, and we sat down and said, Mayor, we want to get to a budget that we can all agree on, and then we can go to the council and say, let's just do this. And we got there. And we got there because I think we made a very clear statement of what we as citizens of the city that these electeds represent wanted. And two, and I do want to get into this a little bit, Beth, is we also changed the complexion of the people that we say, of our advocacy group. We were very intentional. We've been working on this for a couple of years, but it really came that we wanted the people showing up, talking to the mayor and talking to the city council member to look like their constituency.
Yeah, I do think we should pause there, because I think it's probably resonant with a lot of folks that are with us this afternoon. Friends groups grow out of the sincere goodwill of a community to make something they care about deeply stronger. And because that has historically involved financial investment, and financial ability to invest has historically been affiliated with white privilege, a lot of our friends groups are historically really white and white middle class educated, and that's been great. And as our communities evolve, the legitimacy of our advocacy efforts requires that we reflect the communities that we serve, that the library serves, and that the voices who are advocating for the library are the voices of the city. And so, again, it's just a huge bummer that Dur's not able to be with us today. Dur represents, in one of the many identities that she wears, Dur is a Hmong American who was a refugee as a child. And when Dur walks into a room as an advocate and says, I grew up in the arms of the library, which she says to our elected officials, because that is where she learned English. That is where her parents learned how to write, what a resume was and how to write a resume. And now her sister, Kaukalia Yang's books sit on the shelves of our libraries as a published Hmong American author. Were we not to recognize that those voices matter as much or more than those voices that have historically advocated for the library, we risk irrelevancy. I mean, if we're being really honest with ourselves.
Yeah, and that'll apply to any of your communities. The people speaking to the elected decision makers want and need to see the people they represent asking for these resources and explaining why. Dur's story is very strong. We have a number of people in our advocacy group who really do have compelling stories as to why the library has made a difference in their lives. And it has helped us to secure the resources that we need for it to continue to make the same impact on future generations.
We're also better at messaging because we're centering the voices of the people who are users of the library, not just on our board, but on our advocacy committee, and inviting the community as a whole into our advocacy efforts. I think one question I would have if I was sitting there is like, well, if you are a bunch of people who all look like each other, how do you go about expanding your who shows up to advocate, and how do you create an advocacy coalition that is representative of the community you serve? And it's really one of the things I think that really advanced our work in this way was the work we did around the public awareness campaign. When folks were recognizing, like, the libraries are closed not just because of the pandemic, but because the budgets are being cut and there aren't people working in the library to open the library, and that affects me, that affects my family. One of the things that we did is we started showing up at different locations all over the city and distributing lawn signs. I think we are going to look back, Ted, and look at that lawn sign campaign. I wish I should have had one as a prop. We did a lawn sign campaign in the fall of 2020. Yeah, that just said, I'm a friend of the library. Very simple, no negative message, no demands, just identity messaging. I am a friend of the library. And we gave away 1,800 of these lawn signs by being present in shopping centers and in front of clinics and at grocery stores all over the city. And people put them in their yards. And it was a point of pride, and it was an invitation to identify as a library advocate and then become involved in the program. And we are really continuing to benefit from the success of that campaign from that fall.
Well, and equally important is every sign we delivered, we collected the name.
Yeah,
the
yes.
contact information. Some of these people were people we knew, some of these people we'd never seen before. And we reached out to them with our advocacy campaigns. Some of them we invited them to join us at meetings. We invited them to send emails of support to their electeds. If they had relationships with electeds, we asked them to leverage those on their behalf. And the group got us closer to being representative of the people of St. Paul.
It also, if you were a city council or a mayor or elected and were driving around your city, kind of every time you turned around, there was a lawn sign popping up somewhere in your neighborhood, which that also, I think, really, sometimes library supporters are underground. We know we love our libraries, but reading is an isolated activity. Working on the computers often a just solo activity. This was suddenly this sort of very public-facing show of support for the public library as a department of the city. And I think really also kind of laid a groundwork that legitimized, people really do want you to fund the library, Mayor. People really do want you to fund the library, City Council. And so thinking about our advocacy cycle, getting that message from the library director, pulling together a strong coalition, then going in with a consistent message that everybody knows, meeting with the mayor, meeting with the members of City Council, that gets you to the end of an advocacy cycle, with the goal being your mayor and your City Council feel really good about funding the library because they know that they're doing what the people who elected them want them to do, spending money in a way that they would approve of.
Yeah, and how do we know that lawn sign campaign worked? We heard about it from the electeds.
Yes, that's
and,
true.
And that's a good thing. No matter what they say about it, they noticed. But Beth, you bring something up that I think is really important for all of you, is that we have a particular way of budgeting and how the government works in St. Paul. And we know all of you have probably different setups. And so one of the critical things associated with a successful advocacy campaign is really understanding where the power lies in your own community. Some of you may have a strong mayor, strong council system. Some of you may have a city manager system. You got to understand how decisions are made in the city. In some of the suburbs that surround St. Paul and Minneapolis, most of the suburbs that surround St. Paul and Minneapolis, they have a city manager system, meaning that there's a hired manager who makes the initial budget cut, who takes the first shot at the budget. It's important to have that relationship with that individual, as well as your electeds. Some cities have an elected library board. Again, there are two levels of discretion in that situation, where they're often handed a budget by the city council or whatever governing body, and then allocate that budget in a way. You've got to find the power dynamic in your city and be engaged in it all the way up and down the power dynamic.
I think also, I'm so glad you brought this up, because there is so much of it that is nuts and bolts. Who are the decision makers? And then the other thing is, on what timeline and with what mechanisms do they make those decisions? Because if you're really nervous about your library budget being cut in say a July 1 start to a fiscal year, and you start your advocacy June 1st, it is way too late. The reason we're listening to the library director in January and February, and even though the budget won't get passed till December, all the way at the other end of the calendar, is because we need to start socializing the ideas of what we're hoping funding will support by April, May, before the budget even starts to come together in the mayor's office and with the city finance director, so that we've acclimated people to the idea, like, we are not going to settle for budget cuts for the library. So sharpen the pencils now, people. we are going to demonstrate for you that thousands and thousands of St. Paul residents want you to prioritize funding for the library in that next budget cycle, so that by the time the mayor releases his budget, and I think he's statutorily required to in St. Paul to do so by August 15th. Am I remembering that?
Correct.
The budget is pretty well baked by, July. And so we should be doing our meetings in May, June at the latest.
Yeah, and it's often a more condensed calendar, and I'm certain it is in many of your communities. But that if it is a more condensed calendar, that gives you an opportunity to get started even earlier. It's really important that your asks are well reasoned, well communicated, and it doesn't really help to surprise anybody with them.
Right. It's also one of our, Marcus Pope is a member of our advocacy committee. He is the one that keeps saying you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And I think one of the things that is a hallmark of the type of advocacy, we don't always achieve this, but the type of advocacy that we enjoy doing is the collegial partnership approach. The idea that we're not coming in telling a mayor or a city council, like, here's all the things you're doing wrong, we want to have a fight with you. We're going in and saying, when you invest in the library, this is what you're going to get out of it. And we try to really bring the most positive approach possible. And the mechanics of our advocacy do include letters. Sometimes they can include, things that people sign. Oh my gosh, this word just completely,
Petition.
Thank you, petitions. Like, I've lost the English language. Yeah. Petitions, but also just meetings themselves, like calling up and asking, can I please get a half hour either on Zoom or in person with XYZ elected official, and then bringing that positive message forward, thanking them, thanking them for their past support of the library, and hoping for their additional investment, and then asking questions. Because the other thing good advocates are a resource, I think, to elected officials. What can we tell you about the work of the library? How can we bring you closer to understanding just how valuable and valued the library is in the community? And I mean, there are so many times when we have answered questions for our elected officials about what's happening in the library that I'm surprised and kind of thinking, like, how did you not know that? So,
well, and you know, in the spirit of grace and kindness is they got a lot on their mind. They depend on us. They depend on us to help them understand what's important to the community, to us, to the voters. Beth, you think it'd be helpful to just do a quick walk through the mechanical steps, which I think are universal in the sense that these are things that you can and should do in order to be a successful advocate. One, understand the cycle. We've mentioned that before. Find out when the budget decisions are made, and then work backwards as far back as you can to begin the work of delivering your message. You go back to that day and understand what your own priorities are. Spend the time prior on that working with your library director and with your community to identify those things that you can reasonably ask for, whether it's investment in collections, investment in a building, maybe put enough on the budget to hire an additional librarian or a social worker. You know, the things that we seek for our library to do that they aren't currently doing. And then you do begin the conversations. If you're in a city manager city, engage the city manager. Call up the city manager and have that meeting. If you have a relationship with any member at the city council or the mayor, begin the conversation before the conversation has to begin. Talk about your priorities. Within your own organization, socialize that within your organization so that either your advocacy committee or your board or your whole volunteer base are ready when they need to be called on. And then talk through identify the mechanics you're going to do. Are you going to write a letter? Are you going to ask your grassroots group, your committee and or your volunteer base to write similar letters, both to the budget initiator and to the elected who have to approve that budget? And then methodically meet with them as they go forward. Get a sense, listen when you're talking to them, because they're going to give you indications on where they're likely to go. And if you need to adjust your tactics or even adjust your ask as you learn things that's going on, and be prepared to deliver lots of voices to electeds to bolster your case.
Yep. And I think in addition, if there are library board meetings or city council meetings or city manager meetings, convenings of the public, being physically present or Zoomably present for those so that you are seeing the stakeholders are showing up. Even when you're not on the agenda, it's a really good way to understand how the process works, to watch somebody else advocate for the thing that they care about and see what the response is. But when you are on the agenda, be there robustly. We have a really fun question. How do you approach and involve your business and corporate community in your role as library supporters? And again, this is just from the beginning is the first answer. Our advocacy committee itself includes leaders from St. Paul's biggest businesses so that these elected officials see that the business community cares about the health of the library. And again, it goes back to community safety and residency and retention of employees and quality of life, making sure that the interests of those business communities are represented in the library advocacy work to council. But Ted, how else would we involve the business and corporate community in our role as library supporters?
Well, it's worth looking at. Let's say you are a foundation as well. Is look at your donor list. Who from the business community is donating to your library, your library foundation, because their donation doesn't need to be the end of their participation. It's worth having an ongoing, robust relationship with them so that when the time comes, you ask them if they can call the mayor. They call the mayor. Know your chamber of commerce. Participate in your chamber of commerce. Be present in those moments of where the business community gathers, and reversely. And this applies to everything that goes on in the library. Everything that happens in the library is an advocacy opportunity. Make sure that you invite not only your policymakers but your business community. Be a convener if you can, to help strengthen those relationships, so that when those relationships become important, you in the advocacy process, you can tap them.
So another question that we're getting is how do we go about convincing maybe a reluctant board or a reluctant trustee, even individually, that advocacy is part of the work, it's part of the mission?
There are people who just gravitate towards advocacy, and you need to spend time really cultivating them. But yeah, there are folks on the board who might see it as politics, as whatever they think about politics. And honestly, advocacy isn't for everybody. I mean, you build your board based on a variety of factors that people bring to it, but every one of those people is a citizen of someplace. And we have a number of members of our board who don't live in the city of St. Paul, but they either do business in the city of St. Paul or just love the libraries of St. Paul, have a history with the libraries in St. Paul. It's really a matter of finding those people who will do it enthusiastically, because and occasionally it really helps to bring someone who's doing it reluctantly but out of mission. And
yep. Oh, I just love it. So I think about Anne Regan, Ted.
Yeah.
So Anne Regan, none of you will know her who are not from St. Paul. She is an editor who works for our historical society locally. She is a definite introvert. She does advocacy from the deepest place in her heart because she loves libraries so much and believes in the power and importance of equitable access to the resources that are available in a library. She is the most unassuming person, but you put her in a meeting with the mayor, and I know she's so nervous going into this. She cries every year talking about why the library matters. And if you run into the mayor anywhere on the street, he'll be like, "How's Anne Regan doing?" I mean, he just loves her, and she is memorable. She is so authentic, and she just sort of like just pulls herself together because she cares so deeply. And I think the thing I would say about reluctancy is advocacy is not lobbying. You are not lobbying for your own self-interest. Lobbyists, sometimes rightfully, often incorrectly, get a bad rap. But advocacy is really bringing forward the voices of the citizens for the things that you care about and the vision for the city that you believe in, and the sort of end game that you imagine for your community. And a strong library, everybody on this call believes a strong library is a part of that. And so to just sort of dismantle and demystify, it's one person talking to another person about something they care deeply about. Very few people wake up in the morning with the notion, I hate libraries. I can't think of anybody who does that. So it's not like you're advertising for, an oil pipeline or some super controversial thing. You're advocating for libraries. And so it's really just bringing that love, that passion into a conversation with someone who happened to decide they wanted to run for office, got elected, and actually works for you. That's the thing to remember. They work for us.
Absolutely critical. They are your representative on the library board or on the city council or on the county board or whatever elected body ultimately makes the decisions about your library. Whether you voted for that individual or not, they work for you. And so and they are human. And I think that's where you can, if somebody genuinely doesn't want to do it because they're talking to the mayor, they're just a person. He or she is just a human who is there for probably similar reasons that you're sitting on the library board.
Yep. I think too, I would also offer into the conversation around maybe board and cultural institutional reluctancy to do advocacy is consider it part of your equity work, frankly. We, in our most recent strategic planning process at the Friends, explicitly named creating multiple pathways for engagement so that more people could be involved with the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. Historically, the way that people have come into relationship with our organization is by making a donation, writing a check. Not everybody can do that, but everybody has a voice. And so we really see advocacy as a pathway to engagement for folks who are maybe not in a position to make a financial contribution, but want to bring their voice and their passion for the library to that effort. And so one begets the other. And when you do better fundraising, you do better advocacy. When you do better advocacy, you raise your profile and you can do better fundraising. They are just so mutually beneficial and intertwined, but they really are. They're an equity statement, multiple pathways for engagement for people in your community who care about the library.
Well, and more often than not, I've seen people step away from the experience going, that was empowering. That was something that I went in and I had influence. That's neat. And I think that's something to share with your reluctant advocates.
Ted, we have a question that I think probably you could answer, not even just specifically for library advocacy, but more broadly, which is pitfalls that organizations make when they take on advocacy. What is the biggest challenge to a successful advocacy campaign, and what are potential pitfalls that folks have got to avoid?
Well, people do sometimes come in too strong. People do come. It's not. You can't treat it as a confrontation. And there are people who do. It's a collegial activity. It's you're sitting down with individuals who have one thing. You want them. You have something, and you're trying to make a deal. It's treating it like something that it is confrontational. Rarely works, and it never works on behalf of libraries, by the way. People don't. I mean, it's just not good. The other issue is, being smart and realistic about what you're asking for.
Yep, that's a good one.
And that's where the relationship with the library director is particularly helpful. Library directors are much closer to the mechanizations of the public body that they work for than we are. And library directors are closer to the priorities of the individual who hired them than we are. And so really crafting an ask that's both interesting. I do recommend being bold in your asks, but understand what's doable and understand the long game, because there are going to be times when you go in and you ask for something that isn't doable this year, but you're beginning to lay the groundwork for something that will be doable as you make your case.
Yep. I think the one thing I would add to that, a mutual colleague of ours who's also done advocacy for the Friends, Joe, he told me once, don't do the work of elected officials for them. Oftentimes, particularly when budgets are tight, and I have never had the luxury of advocating for anything when budgets weren't tight. Don't do the work of your elected officials for them, because you'll get the question like, well, if we raise the budget of the library, what am I supposed to cut? What would you cut? Don't answer that question. I have been asked a version of that in so many advocacy roles I've held over the years. And that's not your job. They're the ones that ran for office. It's their gig to make those difficult decisions. And so simple answers like, I wouldn't presume to do your job for you, but I'm just simply here to let you know that your constituents are really, really interested in seeing deeper investment in the library, and just kind of neutralizing and deflecting questions that aren't appropriate, because it isn't your job to say you should cut over here so that you can fund over here, because then you have just disenfranchised someone, and that's not what library advocacy is either.
And in fact, you may be in a competitive situation. It's that department's that area is supporter's job to make their case.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and a corollary to that is, and it particularly works, it's particularly important in the work that you're doing, is there's no reason to go negative on anything or anybody. You're doing positive work in the community. You're trying to move the community forward, lean on the positives of what you're doing.
Yep. Ted, we, I think, are coming to the end of questions. I am wondering if there's anything we haven't touched on that you would have last thoughts about, or kind of just sort of final thinking and musing that you may want to do around what is now 9 years of advocacy for the Friends formally on the board, and many of those years as chair of the advocacy committee.
Advocating for libraries is both hard and easy. It's easy in the sense that the libraries, I mean, you are working for things that are inherently good in your community. That's a positive. You get to do that, but you are almost always in a competitive or perhaps difficult budgeting situation. And yes, if you've got a company foundation and you do raise funds for the library, you're in a position to bring some of the funds, but it truly is a community responsibility as well as a community benefit to work for the libraries. It needs to be treated as such. Making the case for the priorities of libraries is empowering. I mean, I think people sometimes shy away from it because it involves politics. It's empowering. You're doing good in the world by doing that work, and should be approached as such. That's the fun stuff. There's also the mechanics that you need to really understand. We talked about that. Know where the power is in your community. Cultivate relationships with where the power is in your community, because they're the people who can help to get things done, and recognize that because you're working with citizens of your community, you are among the powers in the community, and exercise that power well.
I think one final thought that I'm having as we sort of wrap up is, don't make the assumption either that our elected officials know what our contemporary libraries are really all about. I'll go all the way back to the beginning. Ted, you mentioned in passing this idea that libraries are not book repositories. Everybody on this call knows that. But if you have an elected official who maybe hasn't been in the public library for a number of years, if their family, that's just not where they spend their time, or they individually are not a library user, they can be working with an antiquated and outdated idea of the library, which can quickly lead to questions of relevancy. So sometimes before you can ask for what you need, you have to remind yourself that they need to be educated about what the library is. And one of the best ways to do that is to get people into the library. Have those meetings, do that work in your physical libraries when you can. Elaine, I see you're back. I bet that means you're shutting us down.
I am back. Thank you both so much, Beth and Ted. One of the things about doing these kinds of virtual programming and webinars is that the audience can't be in community. I bet that there were a lot of people with me who were nodding. I found myself doing a lot of nodding while you were talking, and I really, really appreciate all of your perspectives and insights. And we'd like to thank our attendees too for spending time with us today, plumbing the depths of what advocacy is and can be for your libraries and your communities. And so thank you for your attendance, your time, your insightful questions. Please reach out to us at Library Strategies with any additional questions or feedback. You can reach us at librarystrategiesconsulting@thefriends.org. I'm also going to put that there in the chat. And so I just want to say again, a huge thank you to you, Ted Davis and Beth Burns, for being a part of this and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today.
Thank you. It was fun.
All right.
Good to see you, Ted.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Bye-bye.